From the book The Essex Boys and Mr. X by Heath Mayfield from Visual Feast Publishing. On this occasion, Mr. X would not ignore the debt, nor would Tate be allowed to go unpunished. What had also been in question was the quality of the sly ecstasy, which had been sourced by Tate, who had purchased it via Nichols from a bit of a shonky source over in Holland. It was a constant source of a drug supply, but they were not quite as particular as Mr. X and his suppliers when it came to the guaranteed purity of the product, something Mr. X was adamant about. Mr. X and the other heavy players would usually buy their drugs from a reliable source who was known and trusted. He was an East End London crook who had trendy and profitable bars in Holland and Belgium. Tate's size, strength, anger and aggression were of no concern to Mr. X, who regarded Tate as a mere tool for him to make money. Tate made the mistake of considering himself to be a feared and dangerous somebody in Mr. X's thinking, but he would never be in Mr. X's league when it came to violence. Mr. X held Tucker and Tate responsible for bringing such intense heat down upon the criminal elements in Essex and for disputing an awful lot of profitable illegal business ventures because he thought that the actual composition of the ecstasy was responsible for Leah Betts' tragic reaction. Mr. X had figured that thousands upon thousands of people had consumed his supplies of ecstasy without suffering any ill effects, providing that they stayed within taking 1 or 2 tubs a night instead of gorging themselves throughout the evening. But Mr. X was also informed enough to know that some other people's chemical makeup simply cannot tolerate ecstasy. After all, the famous brilliantly skilled martial artist Bruce Lee died from a natural reaction to a low-grade painkiller bought over the counter in any pharmacy. But the Leah Betts incident had become the beacon of warning about the dangerous and deadly effects of taking ecstasy. A colossal campaign had been undertaken warning of the dangers of ecstasy to try to dissuade people from consuming it. But it seemed that the younger members of society rejected the warnings and advice as they just loved ecstasy or badly wanted to try it. Hearing of its calming and loving effects made it widely sought after. They seemed to reject the possibility that they would die for consuming just 1 tablet. It was the feel-good cheap formula for a break from everyday boredom or depression, a case of hard lines Leah, but it's not going to happen to me sort of attitude. Oh, this is as innocent as Blackpool Rock and it's cool. Leah Betts had become a high-profile case. Some thought that it was because she was the daughter of a respected ex-policeman. He had insisted on asking Leah's friends, who were prominently downstairs at her party, who had supplied the ecstasy. Before passing out, Leah had admitted to her father Paul that she had taken ecstasy, but nobody was quite sure. When news broke about the condition of Leah Betts, it brought the press in droves, trying to curry favour in order to get newsworthy content. The coverage of the Leah Betts incident had everybody's attention and it invoked a lot of sympathy, but it had caused the availability and purchase of ecstasy to immediately subside on the street and go way underground. It did cease for a relatively short period. Tucker and Tate also pulled on their overactivity at this time and just about went to ground. They were hiding their significant drug stash. The police stated they would examine all avenues of inquiry to expose and prosecute the people responsible for the ecstasy epidemic in the Essex area. There were people losing thousands of pounds a day due to the scare of being too carefully examined, and they were not too happy at all with the situation. For some, this was a very tense, taxing and anger-filling time. Then there was a vital connection that existed between Mr. X and the cocky, colourful and entertaining Steve Nipper Ellis, who was an unsuspected friend. Nipper's connection was through his father, who was well acquainted with Mr. X. Nipper Ellis's father was himself a well-connected man, and he was not a man to be easily threatened or scared by anybody, including Tate and Tucker. They had sent a perceived hitman around to Nipper's father's home to try and put the frighteners on him. Nipper was in hiding at the time. Nipper's father was upstairs in his home when a large man in a long dark coat and wearing gloves had called to Nipper's old man, who was looking out of the upstairs window to see who was knocking on the door asking if Nipper was there. The father told him that Nipper did not live there and asked what the man wanted to see Nipper about. The visitor said he had something for him. The old boy decided to go downstairs to confront the caller. By the time Nipper's father had made his way to the front door to face this threat, the visitor had disappeared. This means of harassment was water off a duck's back to Nipper's father. The visit, however, had set off his shit detectors and he started to make inquiries as to how much trouble his son was in and how much serious the threat he was under. Nipper's father was a very well-respected man in criminal circles, and his associates stretched to all sorts of contacts. There he found more than ample evidence to provide a reason for Nipper to want to see Tucker and Tate dead. Nipper had gone through a period of intense stress with all of the vile things that the pair were responsible for doing to him, robbing his flat of small or minor value items to help set up one of their girlfriends in a flat, smearing excrement all over his belongings and the walls of his flat, and the never-ending threats to kill him in notes that they left about. The warnings had even included Nipper's family members threatening to do cruel things to his 15-year-old sister, including cutting off her fingers. The father found out that Nipper had warned her and that she was terrified. But the final straw for Nipper was that when he banged up in prison, he'd heard that Tate, Tucker and Rolf had supposedly attacked one of his girlfriends out of spite for him. Nipper undoubtedly wanted to kill the trio more than ever. When his father learned of this, things escalated. Nipper's father informed his very close and reliable criminal associate, Mr. X, of the situation. There is no evidence that Nipper's father paid any money to Mr. X to kill the trio, without either Nipper or his father having to do it themselves. However, both were quite capable of doing so. But again, Mr. X may have simply offered to take care of the matter on behalf of Nipper's family, for the same reason that he wanted to protect the Blundell's standing and respect. There was also his intolerance for the trio, whom he despised. Mr. X was therefore aware of the bad blood between Nipper and the drug trio. But Nipper had never faltered in repaying Mr. X whatever money that he had borrowed with interest to finance some of his schemes. When a trusted Nipper had confided in Mr. X that he had already tried to shoot Pat Tate, but had only wounded him in the attempt, he decided to up the ante in their war. Tony Tucker, frothing in the mouth in a drug-induced rage, had bailed Nipper up and threatened to chop off his hand or foot, in retaliation for a misinterpreted comment that Nipper had made to Tucker's girlfriend in a phone call that she'd made to Nipper trying to find Tony. Up until now, Nipper had been close friends with Pat Tate, but Tate's growing drug consumption and increasingly violent outbursts and actions had convinced Nipper that both Tucker and Tate had turned into low-life wasters. He had told them so at one stage before he fired an old shotgun at the pair when they were looking for him. Nipper was convinced that the crazy acting, continually drug-consuming Tucker and Tate were hell-bent on killing him. It had become pathological on their part, as they viewed Nipper as some kind of Judas for assaulting them, calling them losers and wasters. They saw him as trying to destroy the American gangster style of life, which they had deluded themselves they were following. Nipper was fucking up their dearly clung to fantasies and highly distorted take on things. This was a guy who had befriended Pat Tate and even allowed Tate to share his small 3-bedroom flat when Tate was waiting to move into a house he had recently purchased. Nipper could have not been a better or more trusted friend to Tate, and here he was now being seriously threatened with death. Could Nipper really be blamed for thinking Tate to be an ungrateful and miserable bastard who was under the impression that he was the top dog and invincible? It was at this point that Mr. X had made a very telling comment to Nipper that he agreed with and condoned Nipper's intentions. But he said that Nipper should have never relied on the handgun that he tried to kill Tate, nor on the old shotgun that Nipper had fired at Tucker and Rolf. He should have used a very good, old, reliable pump-action shotgun in the first place if he was serious. Was Mr. X telling Nipper that was what he would have used? and then he might just use it if Tate did not repay a loan. Remember that Tate had declared to Tucker and others that he was not going to do so. Tucker had never mentioned to Tate that he owed Mr. X a considerable amount of cash and was concerned about having spent it before repaying it. He had recently been given a potent reminder of the position that he was in. Although he was asset rich at the time, he did not have enough cash on hand to pay back Mr. X on demand. Tucker was becoming anxious and privately afraid. He was desperately looking for a significant cash score to help sort out his problem with Mr. X, £100,000 plus overdue for payment. This fact in itself would have Tucker quietly shitting himself, as he knew only too well how vindictive, spiteful and coldly determined that Mr. X could be. On ordinary social occasions, Mr. X could be extremely well-mannered, cautious, charming and entertaining. He was quite an intelligent, well-read man, but he could turn instantly into another extremely violent personality if angered, a true berserker. Tucker's real excuse for not wanting to show up for a sit-down with Billy Blundell concerning matters that were displeasing Billy and others was that he knew full well the strength of the association between Billy Blundell and Mr. X, so much that he did not want to have to face them. He was also trying to distance himself from Pat Tate at the time. Still, he fell for the seduction when offered an incredible opportunity, and so he fought by Pat Tate, who had fallen for the same offer when supposedly approached by Mick Steele. Tucker had no idea that Mr. X would be involved in any way in the transaction and was not concerned. He was more concerned about Pat Tate. There was also other negative issues existing between them that were still unresolved. Jealousy and mistrust had undoubtedly crept into their relationship, but the thought of their expected score overrode any disputes at the time. Pat Tate had been making comments to the people closest to him about his concerns that Tucker might be shortchanging him with the money that Tucker had been holding for him when he was in prison, and that it might be going into Tucker's new property. He did not know that Tucker had borrowed heavily for the purchase of his large and expensive property. Tate had gone so far as to ask his pal Mick Steele to visit him in prison, and had asked him to keep an eye on Tucker and to question his spending if he could. Although Tate was suspicious of Tucker, he decided to keep him close and sweet so that he could attain more significant profits. As the old saying goes, keep your friends close, but keep your enemies even closer. This is not to say that Tate and Tucker had not been close, reliable friends up until the last stages of their relationship. This was when the cracks started to appear. Trust between them both was now strained. Neither of them knew how much debt the other was in to Mr. X, or what the result might bring. Today, and in video interviews, Nipper can be seen flashing a satisfied sort of smile when he professes that it was not either Steele or Womes who were responsible for the actual shootings. Does that mean that he knows who the real killer was? Maybe Mr. X should have involved Nipper, or at least Nipper's father, as the driver of the getaway vehicle used in the murders, as they could be trusted to keep the identity of Mr. X unknown. Would this have eliminated any need for Darren Nichols to be involved in the conspiracy, and therefore no mention of Mick Steele or Jack Womes would have ever taken place, and neither of them would be in prison today? Or did Mr. X and Nipper's father combine to commit the murders and were responsible for luring the trio to the quiet workhouse lane? It was an area known by all the players for various reasons. It was common knowledge that Pat Tate was a used car dealer and the Range Rover was Pat Tate's responsibility. He had borrowed it from the mechanic car body guy who was fixing Tony Tucker's smashed Porsche, which Pat Tate had crashed. Rolf was the regular chauffeur for Tucker and Tate. He could also be comfortable and useful on occasions, such if Tate wanted to go out to the semi-rural properties to purchase cheap machinery or equipment for some relatively private property, even in the early evening to buy the likes of horse floats that they would resell. There has always been an extreme suspicion held by the people supposedly in the know that Nipper's father and Mr. X were present at the scene and were responsible for the ambush and the killings. If they weren't, shouldn't we wonder how Nichols, Steele and Womes were ever brought into the equation? There would have been no need for their inclusion in any way. Nipper's father could have driven Mr. X to the ambush when Mr. X was responsible for the shootings and left the area via the tracks and rat runs. Some have suspected that the Blundell brothers, Billy and Eddie, or anybody else of a similar standing, could have been present at the ambush scene for whatever reason that may be suggested. Although they would be more than capable of pulling the trigger themselves, as it is shown in their history, it is highly unlikely that either of the Blundell brothers pulled the trigger. What was the reason that the drug trio were there at the ambush site at all? It does not matter a joint in reality. They were there and they suffered the consequences of being there. What puts a fly into the ointment of the soundness of Nipper's father and Mr. X's involvement is it would hardly be likely for Tate to require Tucker and Rolfe to be with him to take care of an ordinary chore that he could complete by himself, take their Range Rover, hook up the horse float and leave. If it was a case of Mr. X and Nipper's father committing the murders, it would have not involved Steele, Womes and Nichols. As a possible trap for the murders, how could they be sure that they could catch all three together at the same time if it was a plan to entice Pat Tate to the country laneway on the pretext of buying a used vehicle or a horse float or something that Tate could resell at a handsome profit? Even if it were a car that was supposed to be the bait, then Tate would have had to bring somebody with him to drive one of the vehicles back to Tate's yard or lockup. It would be unlikely for the whole trio to turn up for a small buy. It would more than likely be Craig Rolfe, as he was a bit of a lackey for Tate. If it did work as a ploy to get all three there at the same time, then Darren Nichols must be credited with having an outstanding criminal mind to have conceived and pulled off an incredible audacious plan, to have heard about the murders merely and then to have woven the tale of Mick Steele and Jack Womes so convincingly as to accusing them of being involved. He's not that bright enough, rat cunning, but not that smart. What? Miraculously arranging both Steele and Womes to be in the area of the murders at the approximate time, and convincingly arranging for them to make and receive telephone calls that could be traceable so smoothly and trouble-free that he sucked in and fooled the whole of the Essex police force, the judge and the jury. And by only claiming to have played a minor unsuspecting role after being supposedly duped into being that driver in an average low-scale drug deal. Not out of spite for Steele and Womes, but purely as a plan to save his ass should he be arrested on drug charges. The mere audacity in doing so is impressive, plus needing the skills of a convincing liar who could pretend to be a bit vague, forgetful, yet incredibly deceptive. Much like the character Verbal Kent, Kaiser Soze, played by Kevin Spacey in the Hollywood movie The Usual Suspects. Then again, we have to question the police department's attitude when it comes to either turning a blind eye to some of the things or the gratings of the immunity to some offenders when it suits their purposes. As in the example that is glaringly obvious that Nipper Ellis must have been granted immunity from prosecution from a slur of severe crimes that he could have been charged with, including attempted murder, shooting with intent, grievously bodily harm, malicious wounding, discharging a firearm, having an unregistered firearm, having ammunition, and more. Thankfully, the minimal amount of charges against him over the matter were laid relating to the attack on Tate, as Nipper admitted being guilty of all of these offences when recorded giving an interview soon after the murders. After all, he was not grassing anybody, only himself in the light of things. Even Nipper's alibi for where he was on the evening of the murders relied on him being an attempted container truck robbery close by Rettendon with close friend Danny Woodard. Nipper had wounded Pat Tate in the arm when he fired a shot at him trying to kill him, firing through his bathroom window as Tate was shaving. Then, whilst in hospital, at the time due to the injury in his arm, Tate had told Tucker and Rolfe that he knew it was Nipper who had taken the shot at him. Tucker stupidly supplied Tate with a gun to hide under his pillow or somewhere for self-protection if Nipper was to arrive at the hospital, meaning to complete the mission to kill Tate. This is how drug-induced paranoid that Tate, Tucker and Rolfe had started to become. A drug-sodden Three Stooges move played out again. Other unanswered questions are, what was the real reason behind Darren Nichols' unexpected and uninvited appearance at the hospital to visit the injured Pat Tate? It may be that he was a registered and paid police informer and he was trying to gain information about Tucker and Tate. Had he been asked by the police handler to try and somehow integrate himself with Tate, of which Nichols had been harassing McSteele to try and arrange an introduction? Did Tony Tucker supply Tate with a firearm whilst in hospital on the grounds he might be in further danger from Nipper? Did Tucker set up Tate so that he would break his parole conditions and be returned to jail and give Tucker a bit of a respite from Pat Tate for a while? The trio of drug dealers was well known by the Essex police and was under surveillance at the time. At one point, Tucker and Rolfe had gone to Nipper's home in the evening time and were lurking around Nipper's flat's rear garden. As he challenged them, he fired a blast of an old shotgun that he had, causing Tucker to dive to the floor, whimpering at the thought of severe retaliation. His so-called hard-man, erotic stance and invincible demeanour that Tucker had portrayed had abandoned him. Then he jumped to his feet and fled in terror like a rat up a drainpipe as Nipper fired another 2 rounds at the fleeing Tucker and Rolfe, luckily for them not hitting either of them. This incident led to Nipper initially being arrested and threatened with serious charges. The police had agreed not to press all of the charges against Nipper if he were to make a statement to them. They were hoping to get some valuable and useful information from Nipper regarding the murders. He agreed with the police that he would make a full and honest statement as to what Nipper might know about the murders, not necessarily what the police might have thought that he knew of the murders. It had turned out that Nipper had nothing to say concerning anything to do with the Rettendon murders, even though he made no bones about stating that there were plenty of people who were glad to hear about them being dead. It was even suggested by many that the police were responsible for the murders as payback on behalf of Leah Betts' father Paul, and that there may well have been some police that would have been prepared to commit such an act. And there well may have been many that would have condoned the murders, but they were nowhere as aggrieved as other more offended members of society. The conspiracy theorists insist that Paul Betts was a senior police officer and was well versed in the use of firearms, and he was an average shooter. Plus, he had police associates ready to kill on his behalf. There is also a declaration in Tiberius' report on police corruption. A well-known villain and professional killer had volunteered to act on behalf of the police and kill the trio. Then there was widespread talk and rumour on the streets concerning the possible involvement of well-known crime families, such as the Adams family, the Hunt family, the Bowers family, the Blundell family, and others. All heavy-duty players and others named in the police corruption report Tiberius and others. Corruption seemed to be endemic throughout the Metropolitan Police Force and other regional forces. It was as deemed as to be so ingrained and far-reaching that a feared criminal family had placed a £1 million contract killing on 3 honest, loyal and sincere high-ranking detectives. The detectives being Detective Inspector David McKelvey and 2 of his assistants. David McKelvey was known to be a hands-on, first-through-the-door arresting officer, one who led by example. He had received over 60 commendations. He had fallen victim of some very heavy and serious criminals due to his tendencies and thorough planning and actions in police raids. A story was circulated throughout police ranks that there was a police officer referred to as Dirty Dave who was in league with known heavy criminals. This rumour led to suspicions and accusations that David McKelvey was the Dirty Dave in question, which amounted to so many accusations and speculation which was made against David McKelvey that he resigned in disgust from the police force. Knowing that the level and depth of corruption prevailing throughout the police forces was far too unacceptable for him, therefore sacrificing a job that he loved and believed in once upon a time. Another innocent victim thrown under the bus, because he was in the way of what should have been an interrupted major flow of stolen goods, plus too dodgy persistent in his investigations. Incidentally, David McKelvey was one of the officers involved in the arrest of Darren Nichols. Plus, he has stated openly and publicly that he does not agree with the verdict handed down on Steele and Wombs. He has recently posted on social media. It reads as follows: "The cell site information proves that it is highly unlikely that Michael Steele was in Workhouse Lane at the time of the murders. It actually corroborates his alibi. Michael Steele was a cunning career criminal. Why would he use a man he knew was a police informant to drive on a triple murder? Why would he use a £50 scrapper of a car that regularly broke down as a getaway vehicle? Why did he not have a sound alibi for the time he was allegedly killing Pat, Tony and Craig? The number of inconsistencies in this case and the manipulation of evidence is outstanding. Our team of highly experienced senior investigating officers are daily trawling through the evidence, all hard-nosed career detectives. We cannot believe the incompetence of the police involved. Murder squad officers having affairs with primary witnesses, a blinkered approach to the evidence, the protected witness having days out with the media, evidence being manipulated, vital material being withheld and hidden from the defence, murder team members getting convicted or sacked for dishonesty or misconduct, and so the list goes on. It is clear that from very early on they decided Michael Steele was involved and guilty, and as a result ignored everything else to the contrary. It is quite incredible. The telephone material that now exists proves that neither Michael Steele or Jack Wombs were at the scene. It also proves highly unlikely that Tony, Pat or Craig were in Workhouse Lane at the time the police and Nichols says the murders occurred. The timeline corroborated that. If they were not executed at the time and in the manner according to Nichols' account, then his evidence is false. I doubt that those actually involved will ever be brought to justice, but hopefully the truth will emerge, and this miscarriage of justice will see the release of two innocent men of the murder.